imagine an elderly woman,
Right.
like a 78-year-old grandmother.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
She is sitting completely calmly in a local school superintendent's office,
Right.
and she refuses to leave.
Mm.
She's just sitting there reading the book of Leviticus out loud, word for word, for literally 3 hours straight.
Wow.
And she's doing this to stop a school event she disagrees with. Now, to most people looking in from the outside, that is a disruptive public nuisance.
Yeah. I mean, maybe even a little unhinged to some people.
Exactly. But to the rapidly growing audience of the book we're exploring today, she is not a nuisance at all. She is like a frontline soldier engaging in a literal spiritual war.
It's such a stunning visual, honestly, and it perfectly encapsulates the sheer intensity of the source material we're unpacking today. I mean, we're looking at a worldview where cultural shifts are no longer viewed as mere, political disagreements.
Right, there are battles for civilizational survival. And that is exactly why we are so glad you are here with us for today's deep dive. We are talking directly to you, the listener, because we know you might be tuning in specifically to understand the massive, dizzying cultural shifts happening in our modern institutions right now.
Yeah, we're talking about the schools, the military, the boardrooms, the family courts, all of it.
Before we jump into this absolute labyrinth, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of these deep dives. Today, we have a monumental undertaking.
We really do.
We are conducting an extensive, highly detailed review of a really provocative new ebook that has just taken certain corners of the internet by storm. It's called Dealing with Evil: God's Justice and the War on Cultural Marxism, published in 2025 by Conrad Reicher.
And we highly recommend that if you are intrigued by the architecture of these arguments, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Oh, absolutely. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Reicher at Substack. That's at CONRADNRIKER on Substack.
So, dealing with this text, it requires a very specific approach from us today.
It really does. So let's establish exactly what we're doing here. Reicher's book has been making massive waves, specifically within the manosphere.
Right, among men's rights activists.
Yeah, and for men seeking to understand the history of our institutions before they were, well, in Reicher's view, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
It's a highly controversial, ultra-detailed blueprint. He attempts to explain exactly how Western society went from a traditional patriarchal structure to what we see today.
Because of that, I think we need to explicitly state the ground rules for how we're operating today.
Yeah, I'll take that. The source material is intensely politically charged. It is polarizing by its very design. So we want to emphasize to you, the listener, that we, as your hosts, are never taking sides here.
Never.
We're not endorsing, nor are we condemning the left-wing or right-wing viewpoints presented in this text. Our mission today is strictly analytical. We are acting as impartial guides to unpack, explore, and understand the worldview, the underlying mechanisms, and the specific data that Conrad Reicher presents.
Right. We're mapping out his ideological framework so you can understand it from the inside out, regardless of where you personally stand. We're putting on our explorer hats, descending into this specific ecosystem, and figuring out how the machinery of this argument actually works.
So here's our narrative roadmap.
Go for it.
First, we're going to explore Reicher's theory of the ideological battlefield.
Which is the actual historical mechanism of how he believes institutions were captured.
Exactly. Second, we will look at his foundational biological arguments regarding testosterone and what he calls the natural order.
Okay.
Third, we're taking a hard turn into his intense critique of the modern legal system, specifically marriage and Title IX.
That part gets heavy.
Oh, very. Fourth, we'll examine his breakdown of modern feminism and the rise of the tradwife movement. And finally, we'll explore his proposed counteroffensive.
Right, the tactical blueprint he gives his readers to fight back.
So let's begin at the absolute foundation, segment 1, the ideological battlefield and the long march. Reicher sets the stakes incredibly high right out of the gate.
He doesn't frame the current cultural divide as a debate over, tax policy or healthcare.
No, not at all. He frames it as a spiritual and ideological war.
I mean, he literally calls the current institutional culture Sodom 2.0.
Yeah, he does.
But how does he trace the origin of this? Because he doesn't just blame the internet or modern politicians, he goes way back.
He goes back to the 1930s, specifically to a group of Marxist scholars known as the Frankfurt School.
Okay, so the 1930s.
Right. And to understand Reicher's framework, you have to understand the mechanism of their strategy. Following World War I, classical Marxists expected the working class in Western capitalist societies to rise up in violent armed revolution.
Just like what happened in Russia.
Exactly like Russia, but it didn't happen. The Western middle class was becoming too economically comfortable. So, according to Riker, the intellectuals of the Frankfurt School realized that an economic revolution was impossible. They had to pivot.
So if you can't overthrow the government with guns because people, they like their cars and their washing machines, what do?
You devise a new strategy, which famously became known as the Long March through the institutions.
A long march.
Right. Riker posits that instead of targeting the economy, these theorists targeted culture. The mechanism was to slowly, methodically infiltrate the pillars of society that create meaning.
Like which pillars?
Academia, the media, the courts, public schools, and the arts.
Oh, wow.
The goal was to subvert the traditional Western Christian moral framework from within, replacing it with a framework of perpetual grievance and critical theory.
And the core of his thesis is that this 1930s playbook didn't just fade away into history books. He argues it is actively operating right now, just with better PR.
Precisely. He argues it was repackaged for the modern era through corporate and educational initiatives. He specifically targets DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
In the corporate world. And SEL.
Social emotional learning in public schools.
Yeah. He describes this ideological shift as a virus. Or, in a very specific metaphor, he calls it Satan's latest firmware update.
Let's pause on that phrase for a second. Satan's latest firmware update. Because that really reveals how he views the threat.
How so?
Well, a firmware update implies something systematic. It's code that gets pushed out from a central server to every single connected device. It fundamentally rewrites how the hardware operates without the user even realizing it's happening.
And that is exactly how he views these institutional initiatives. It's a mechanism designed to replace traditional religion and, well, objective biological truth with a new secular priesthood.
Yeah.
He even compares modern progressive activists to a leaked 1983 KGB manual on active measures.
Wait, a KGB manual?
Yeah, this Cold War manual detailed how Soviet intelligence planned to infiltrate American media, erode traditional family structures, and replace national identity with localized identity-based conflict.
So to Riker, what the KGB wrote down as a hypothetical strategy to destroy a nation
is exactly what modern NGOs and corporate diversity officers are executing verbatim today, simply under the guise of empathy.
Okay, I want to know what this actually looks like on the ground, though. Because geopolitical theory is one thing, but how does Riker prove this is happening in daily life? Does he have specific examples?
He brings it right down to the local municipal level. He focuses heavily on elementary schools. For instance, he highlights a Texas mother who stormed a school board meeting because she found her third grader with a coloring book page of Karl Marx.
A coloring book of Karl Marx.
Yeah.
That sounds like a parody, like a literal joke.
He argues it's deliberately subtle pedagogy. It wasn't just a historical portrait of Marx, it was Karl Marx drawn as a friendly lion.
A friendly lion?
Yes, and the text had this lion teaching little lion cubs how to smash the bourgeoisie.
Okay, I see the mechanism there. You aren't giving an 8-year-old a copy of Das Kapital and expecting them to understand dialectical materialism?
No, of course not.
You are giving them the emotional resonance of the ideology. You're associating the destruction of class structures with a friendly, comforting cartoon character.
Exactly. Riker uses this to illustrate that the infiltration isn't happening in secret anymore. It is embedded in the foundational lesson plans. And he takes this critique even further when he turns his sights on the public library system.
The library system. I mean, how does a place where you borrow mystery novels fit into a Marxist takeover?
Riker views libraries as the ultimate, trusted, publicly funded battlegrounds. He cites a 2022 Librarian Guild survey claiming that 73% of librarians now openly identify as progressive activists.
73%?
Yeah. He argues their operational mission is no longer purely literacy or archival neutrality, but active ideological conversion.
He gives a really visceral anecdote about this, right? The mother and the toddler.
Yes. He describes a mother watching her toddler reach for a board book called The ABCs of LGBT instead of a traditional classic like Green Eggs and Ham.
Right.
And he follows that up with an example of a mother finding a pamphlet on how to chest bind.
Which is, just to clarify, instructions on flattening prepubescent breasts with compression garments.
Exactly. And this pamphlet was placed on a display right next to the very hungry caterpillar.
So to Riker, framing those materials side by side isn't just an accident of shelving.
No, he frames public libraries not as neutral zones of learning, but as secular monasteries. He claims that the people curating these displays are pushing a specific orthodoxy on children before those children even have the cognitive development to question it.
Let me stop you there and push back on Riker's premise for a
All
second.
right, go ahead.
He paints this as a highly coordinated militaristic takeover. He's citing KGB manuals, the Frankfurt School, deliberate pedagogical strategies. But is he describing a top-down, secret room conspiracy with a grand leader? Or is he just describing the emergent behavior of a shifting culture?
What do you mean?
It's like looking at a massive flock of birds turning all at once in the sky. Riker's essentially pointing at the flock and saying, look, there's a pilot up there orchestrating this, but what if it's just the wind? What if it's just millions of individuals acting on a new set of cultural incentives without any central command?
That is a fundamental question when analyzing cultural shifts. But within Riker's framework, that distinction is actually irrelevant.
Really?
Irrelevant. Yeah. Whether it is a smoke-filled room of conspirators or a self-organizing emergent cultural shift, the practical outcome, he argues, is identical.
So the flock of birds still flies into the jet engine either way.
Exactly. Riker focuses on the outcomes. He points to things like the 1619 Project, noting that its lead writer has spoken about engaging in myth-making to reframe American history.
Right.
He looks at the active replacement of classical Western education with what he terms woke ideology. To Riker, when you have an entire interconnected system, media, academia, publishing actively working to rewrite its own founding myths and demonize its own historical heroes, you don't actually need a central command bunker.
The ideology itself acts as the pilot.
Yes. The incentive structure rewards compliance, meaning people participate in the erasure of their own history whether they realize they are foot soldiers or not.
That is a terrifyingly complete theory of how institutions change. But here is the fascinating pivot Riker makes. He spends all this time outlining this hyper-efficient ideological capture, tracing it back a century, showing how deeply it has penetrated the culture.
Yeah.
But then he confidently asserts that this entire massive programming effort is ultimately destined to completely fail.
And that leads us to the second major pillar of his worldview: biology, testosterone, and the natural order. Riker believes that no matter how entrenched this ideological programming is, it will fail because it's attempting to override something infinitely more powerful.
The reality of human biology.
Precisely.
He has a phrase for this, actually. Biology doesn't bend to hashtags.
See, it's a catchy line.
It really acts as the bedrock for his entire philosophy. Riker argues that evolutionary psychology, the brutal realities of nature, absolutely demand male leadership and traditional gender roles.
He views history through an intensely biological and evolutionary lens. He argues that the Roman Empire didn't conquer the known world because they sat in circles wearing gender-neutral togas and discussing their feelings.
Right, they conquered through discipline, physical sacrifice, and testosterone-fueled ambition.
And he anchors this by citing a 2021 meta-analysis claiming that societies with rigid, male-dominated leadership structures survive, on average, 300% longer than any matriarchal or egalitarian experiments in human history.
Surviving 300% longer is a massive claim. He's anchoring his philosophy not just in cultural tradition, but in pure evolutionary survival rates. He's basically saying, look at the scoreboard of human history.
Yeah.
What specific data does he use to back up this idea of inherent male competence in the modern world, though?
He leans heavily on corporate and physiological data. For instance, he points to a 2023 Harvard study that analyzed thousands of firms during periods of economic distress.
Okay, what did it find?
Well, according to Riker's interpretation of the text, this study found that male-led firms outperformed their heavily inclusive or diverse rivals by 22%, specifically in the metric of crisis resilience.
22% better in a crisis. How does he explain that mechanism? Why would a male-led firm be more resilient?
He attributes it directly to the physical hormone of testosterone. He calls it biochemical audacity.
Biochemical audacity, wow.
Yeah, he argues that testosterone biologically drives individuals to push through catastrophic failure, to take immense risks, and to act decisively without seeking group consensus or emotional validation. During a crisis, a committee fails, but a decisive leader survives.
That makes sense in his framework.
Furthermore, he brings up University of Texas research showing that men's testosterone levels actually rise by 18% during physical manual labor compared to sitting at a desk.
So he is suggesting that men are biologically rewarded by their own endocrinology for building things, for fixing things, for engaging with physical reality.
Yes. And he uses this biological reality to launch a blistering attack on the modern concept of male privilege, utilizing one of his starkest statistics. Men make up 93% of all workplace fatalities.
That is a number that stops you in your tracks. 93%. How does he weave that into his critique?
When progressive activists talk about the patriarchy and male privilege, Riker counters by explaining what that privilege actually looks like at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. He argues that male privilege is dying face down in a coal slurry.
Oh, man.
It's falling off a freezing oil rig in the North Sea. It's getting crushed under heavy machinery on a construction site just to keep the lights on and the supply chains moving for the rest of society.
He argues that the men doing the actual protecting and building do not have the luxury of complaining about microaggressions because they are out there absorbing the physical violence of the natural world.
Exactly. The contrast he draws there is super intentional. He wants the reader to juxtapose the visceral reality of a man freezing on an oil rig with the theoretical complaints happening in university classrooms.
Which brings us to one of the most surreal examples in the book, the feminist glaciology chapter.
Oh, this one is wild. It sounds like an internet parody, but Riker uses it as his prime example of institutional decay. He details a real-world 2016 course and research paper originating from the University of Oregon.
Though he often lumps it in with broader academic absurdity.
Right, and this paper literally labeled glaciers massive inanimate blocks of frozen water as gendered constructs of colonial oppression.
I remember reading this part and just pausing. How do you even begin to gender a piece of ice?
The academic argument was that the historical study of glaciers was dominated by masculine, imperialist perspectives that focused on conquering nature, rather than indigenous or feminist perspectives that view the ice differently.
But to Riker, this isn't just silly, it's a symptom of a civilization that has lost its mind.
Yeah, and he points out that the National Science Foundation actually awarded an $842,000 grant to study this snowflake theory before public outrage brought it to light.
Over $800,000 of taxpayer money. You can see how Riker uses these highly provocative, almost absurd examples to intentionally enrage his audience. He wants to make academia look completely, hopelessly detached from physical reality.
He even includes a quote from an Alaskan crab fisherman who hears about this study and says, quote, "Tell those eggheads to haul a glacier uphill in a 40-knot wind. Then we'll talk about oppression."
It perfectly highlights his core dichotomy, right? The physical reality of the working man versus the abstract absurdity of the modern institution. And Riker absolutely relishes contrasting that academic weakness with stories of raw, undeniable male strength imposing itself on the system.
Absolutely.
Right? He doesn't just want men to complain, he wants them to act. Does he have an example of that biological reality fighting back against the ideology?
He does. He shares a highly vivid story about a father in Ohio. This father finds out his son's school sent home a gender identity worksheet asking the children to declare their pronouns and gender spectrum.
Okay, so how does he react?
Well, the dad doesn't write an angry email to the principal. He doesn't start a change.org petition. He physically goes to the classroom for a parent-teacher conference. Riker describes this man as someone who routinely bench presses 315 pounds.
Setting the scene.
Yeah. The father walks into the room, looks at the teacher, physically lifts the teacher's heavy wooden desk entirely over his head.
Wait, lifted a whole desk over his head.
Over his head, holds it there effortlessly, and says, "My boy learns biology, not pronouns."
And what was the outcome of that?
According to Riker, the school quietly scrapped the worksheet the very next day.
It's an incredible cinematic visual. But let's pause and analyze the logic here, because that creates a paradox.
How so?
If Riker firmly believes that male dominance, testosterone, and this evolutionary drive are essentially indestructible, hardwired biological firmware, if men are these unstoppable, desk-lifting forces of nature, why is he so deeply anxious about a diversity seminar?
That's a fair point.
Right, like, why write a whole book? Can a boring PowerPoint presentation about equity actually undo a million years of hardwired evolutionary biology?
That is the essential friction of his thesis. Riker's internal logic does account for it, however. He doesn't believe biology can be permanently erased. He says nature always bats last.
Okay.
But he argues that biology can be temporarily suppressed through cultural conditioning and institutional punishment. And the cost of that temporary suppression is catastrophic.
So you can't kill the instinct, but you can drug it, shame it, or legislate it into a coma.
Precisely. And he points to Sweden as his primary case study for this mechanism. He details how Sweden implemented aggressive, state-sponsored, gender-neutral reforms. Preschools actively avoided calling kids boys or girls.
Wow.
Natural male competitiveness and roughhousing were treated as behavioral issues and actively punished, while docility was rewarded. Riker claims the long-term result was a 30% drop in male college enrollment and a massive spike in male depression.
Because their natural drives are being pathologized.
Right. When traits like decisiveness, physical aggression, and stoicism are treated as toxic, men don't suddenly become docile, perfectly egalitarian citizens. They simply disengage.
Yeah, check out.
They withdraw their labor and their ambition. Riker argues that suppressing nature doesn't create a utopian equality, it creates a generation of unmotivated, lost men.
And a society that neuters its builders and protectors, he says, is committing Darwinian suicide.
Yes, it will eventually just be outcompeted or physically conquered by a society that still embraces martial masculine virtues.
That is a bleak prognosis. But if the ideology fails to naturally suppress that biology, if men are still inherently driven to be masculine, then the institutions have to use the actual coercive force of the state to keep men in line.
Right.
And that transition leads us directly into segment 3. Riker's incredibly scathing, legally dense critique of the modern legal system, what he terms the marriage plantation, and the weaponization of Title IX.
This is perhaps the most economically detailed section of his entire book. He spends pages dissecting the historical shift in family law. He introduces the concept of the marriage plantation.
Which is such a loaded term.
Highly loaded. He argues that the combination of no-fault divorce, which allows a contract to be broken by one party for any reason, and modern alimony laws has effectively turned the institution of marriage into legalized financial servitude for men.
How does he justify describing a voluntary legal contract as servitude, though?
He argues it is no longer a partnership of mutual benefit, but a liability contract where men are presumed guilty until proven bankrupt. He breaks down the mechanism of how family courts operate, arguing that the state steps in as a surrogate husband.
A surrogate husband. That's a strong image.
He points out that men lose primary child custody 82% of the time, regardless of their fitness as fathers.
82%.
But the economic argument is where he really drills down. He claims that 65% of alimony recipients are women who hold degrees in notoriously low-paying, socially progressive fields.
Like what?
Specifically things like gender studies, sociology, or the arts.
Wait, let's unpack the implication there. He is saying that blue-collar men who are doing the dangerous physical labor we talked about earlier are legally mandated by a judge to subsidize the lifestyles of women who are actively participating in the woke industrial complex that despises those same men.
That is exactly the irony he highlights. The state forces the builder to fund the activist. He gives real-world examples that are just brutal. He talks about a factory worker in Detroit working double night shifts entirely to fund his ex-wife's degree in decolonial basket weaving.
Decolonial basket weaving, you can't make that up.
And he details the case of a construction worker in New York who was literally ordered by a family court judge to pay emotional support alimony to his ex-wife specifically for the care of her dead cat.
A dead cat? You mean a live cat she bought to cope?
No, a literal taxidermied dead cat.
What? That is insane.
Right. A dead cat that she apparently kept taxidermied on her living room couch. Riker uses this Kafkaesque example to demonstrate that the family courts aren't interested in logic, fairness, or even the welfare of children. They're solely interested in the extraction and transfer of male wealth.
And he explicitly links this legal extraction to homelessness.
Yes, to the staggering statistic that 70% of the unsheltered homeless population are men. He argues that many of these men weren't born into poverty. They were pushed onto the streets by ruinous, state-enforced divorce settlements that stripped them of their assets and their will to work.
The legal battlefield isn't just contained to divorce court, though. Riker pivots hard into the campus legal system. He takes aim at Title IX, which he refers to as Salem 2.0, and a modern witch hunt.
He focuses entirely on the weaponization of the process and the presumption of guilt.
He notes that the CDC itself admits that roughly 1 in 10 rape claims are provably false. And Riker is quick to point out that this rate is exponentially higher than the rate of false reports for other serious crimes, like armed robbery or auto theft.
Yeah, he wants to highlight the absolute devastation of what happens when a man is caught in this system. So he details the story of Brian Banks.
The Brian Banks case is a cornerstone of his argument regarding institutional bias. For those who don't know, Brian Banks was a high school football star in California, heavily recruited, absolutely headed for the NFL.
He had his whole life ahead of him.
Exactly. He was falsely accused of assault by a classmate.
Oh.
Because of the pressure of the system and the threat of a massive sentence, he took a plea deal. He spent over 5 years in prison before he was fully exonerated when his accuser was caught on tape, admitting she fabricated the entire story.
But Riker's point is that the exoneration did not reset the clock.
Exactly. The system doesn't have an undo button. Banks lost his prime athletic development years. His NFL dreams, his earning potential, his reputation were completely destroyed.
It's devastating.
But the kicker, the part that drives Riker's point home and really fuels his audience's rage, is what happened to the accuser. The woman who admitted she completely fabricated the story to destroy a young man's life was allowed to keep a $1.5 million settlement payout she had received from the school district.
Wow. And if we zoom out and synthesize Riker's conclusion here, we hit a crucial insight into his worldview. To Riker, false accusations on college campuses and blatantly biased outcomes in family courts aren't examples of a broken legal system.
Right.
He doesn't think the system needs a few legislative tweaks or better judges. He argues that these systems are functioning exactly as intended by the feminist ideology that captured them.
It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yes. The mechanism is working perfectly. The entire apparatus is designed to extract male labor, male wealth, and male obedience.
Yeah, the ever-present threat of total financial and social ruin the idea that you could lose your kids, your house, or your freedom on a single accusation is the leash used to keep naturally aggressive, independent men compliant.
But what happens when an animal realizes it is wearing a leash?
It tries to slip the collar.
Exactly. And this leads to a massive sociological phenomenon Riker describes as the marriage strike.
The marriage strike.
Right.
Men are looking at the legal realities, they are looking at the family court statistics, they are doing the brutal math, and they are simply opting out.
Yeah, they are refusing to participate in dating and marriage entirely to protect their assets. He mentions massive online communities, subreddits with millions of men, whose entire purpose is advising each other on how to avoid the legal contract of marriage at all costs.
They're finding loopholes. Some men, who still want a partnership, are turning to highly specialized prenups for guys drafted by aggressive Las Vegas contract lawyers to try and shield themselves from family court precedent.
Right.
Others are completely checking out of the Western dating pool entirely. Riker interviews a high-earning software engineer who packed up and moved to Ukraine to find a traditional fiancé.
Someone who actually appreciates his role as a provider, rather than viewing his work ethic as toxic ambition.
But let's look at the underlying logic here, because there is a glaring contradiction.
What is it?
Well, Riker is a massive advocate for militant fatherhood. He writes extensively about the need for traditional families, for men to be patriarchs, to build intergenerational legacy. But in the exact same breath, he is telling these young men that the legal system is so hopelessly rigged, so dangerously biased, that they should go on a marriage strike and avoid the contract altogether.
I see what you mean.
It's like telling a young man that he absolutely must win a game of chess to save his soul, but also warning him that sitting down at the chessboard is a lethal trap. How does he reconcile demanding fatherhood while demanding a strike? Isn't retreating exactly what his ideological enemies want? Doesn't checking out contradict his whole point about men being the builders of civilization?
That is an excellent pushback. Riker reconciles this apparent contradiction through the lens of a tactical retreat. He isn't telling men to abandon the concept of family, he is telling them to abandon state-sanctioned family.
Oh, interesting.
He advises men to build families completely outside the reach of what he calls gynocratic courts. He talks about men who do have children using specialized legal apps to track every single hour of custody, every text message, every penny spent.
Treating it like a business transaction.
Treating modern family law not as a mediation service, but as a hostile, occupying entity that must be legally outflanked. You don't play chess by their rules, you flip the board over, refuse the state's license, and create your own sovereign household based on private contracts and religious vows, starving the state of its jurisdiction.
So the goal is to reclaim the definition of family away from the government entirely. And if a critical mass of men execute this strike, if they withdraw their emotional and financial participation from the traditional societal structure, there leaves a massive vacuum.
Which naturally leads us to segment 4. Riker argues that this male withdrawal is causing the feminist movement to slowly cannibalize itself. We're talking about the collapse of the girl boss and the rise of the tradwife rebellion.
Right. Riker's argument in this section is that the core promise of modern feminism was fundamentally a lie. The promise was that abandoning the traditional family structure for corporate careerism and sexual independence would bring women ultimate fulfillment and equality.
But he argues it promised them existential freedom and instead delivered crushing, unprecedented loneliness and anxiety.
He points to the utter cultural collapse of the girl boss era. The idea that a woman's highest calling is to be a CEO. And as proof that women are waking up to this broken promise, he highlights the massive explosion of the tradwife movement on platforms like TikTok.
Which is huge, noting it has well over 500,000 highly active followers.
Yeah.
These are young, often highly educated women who are intentionally rebelling against the corporate rat race. They are quitting their jobs to embrace traditional domestic roles, baking sourdough, making clothes, submitting to their husbands, and raising children.
To unpack why this is happening, Riker introduces two specific mechanisms he calls cat lady economics and the Madonna whore collapse. Let's break those down because they're really provocative terms.
Yeah.
What exactly is cat lady economics in his framework?
Cat lady economics refers to the economic paradigm where women, having achieved corporate parity, are now frequently out-earning their male peers in certain urban demographics.
Okay.
However, because their biological hypergamous instinct still demands a mate who earns more than them, they effectively price themselves out of the mating market.
So they have money, but no suitable partners.
Exactly. They accumulate wealth, but they cannot find a biologically acceptable partner. This leads to a lifestyle of high consumerism focused on surrogate children, like expensive pets and endless therapy to cope with the resulting isolation.
Wow.
He pairs this with a Gallup study showing that 45% of Gen Z women report feeling overwhelmed by loneliness, even as they continuously swipe left on average perfectly capable men on dating apps.
So they're drowning in isolation while waiting for a top 1% man who either doesn't exist or who has so many options he refuses to settle down. And what about the Madonna whore collapse?
That is his theory, that feminism tried to merge the respected traditional mother figure and the liberated, consequence-free sexual agent into one identity. But instead of empowering women, it collapsed the social structures that previously protected them.
Yeah.
It commodified women on apps like Tinder, stripping them of traditional respect and leaving them exposed to a hypersexualized marketplace where they lose their value as they age.
And to back up this idea that women's desires haven't evolved past the 1950s, Riker again brings in a mountain of evolutionary data regarding female mating choices. He focuses relentlessly on hypergamy.
Which is the innate instinct to marry up in status and physical dominance.
Right. The data he selects is meticulously chosen to prove that despite decades of rigorous feminist conditioning in schools and media, women's biological preferences haven't changed a single inch.
He quotes a 2021 University of Miami study showing that men over 6 feet tall earn 20% more than their shorter counterparts.
So, tall guys make more money.
Yeah, and he uses this to imply that society, and women specifically, still subconsciously demand and reward sheer physical stature and dominance.
He also looks at Bumble statistics, right? A dating app nominally designed to empower women.
Yeah, showing that a staggering 68% of female users absolutely refuse to even consider dating an unemployed man, while 73% still expect the man to pay for the first date.
His point with this data is simple. Women demand absolute 50-50 equality in the boardroom when things are safe, but they instantly revert to traditional evolutionary expectations of male provision the second the dinner check arrives or a physical threat appears.
Exactly. And he drives this point home with an incredibly revealing anecdote about a highly successful OnlyFans creator. This is a woman who is in the top 0.1% of earners on the platform. She quit the industry completely to become a traditional homemaker. She told Riker in an interview, quote, "I made bank selling nudes, but crying into cash stacks gets lonely. Now I want a man who stacks firewood."
That is such a potent quote for his audience. It highlights a deep, unshakable craving for physical protection and tangible, masculine utility over abstract, digital wealth.
If we look at Riker's objective conclusion in this section, he defines modern feminism as a schizophrenic cult. He argues it demands the privileges of equality when convenient, but still deeply, fundamentally relies on male providers for physical protection, infrastructure maintenance, and financial stability.
He uses a humorous but pointed example, right?
Oh yeah, of a progressive, radically feminist lesbian couple who ultimately had to hire a male handyman to renovate their house because, as they admitted in a viral post, drywall doesn't fix itself.
But wait, let's unpack his view of gender dynamics here, because I notice a massive discrepancy in how he treats the two sexes.
What do you mean?
Throughout the book, Riker seems to view men as possessing almost absolute existential agency. Men can choose to strike, they can choose to build, they can choose to fight the legal system, they can flip the chessboard. But he views women's behavior almost entirely through the lens of rigid, deterministic biological firmware.
Like hypergamy, nesting instincts, hormonal drives.
Exactly. Does the source material actually allow for female agency at all? Or does Riker view women as basically just passive subjects, reacting to whatever social structure men decide to build and enforce?
That is a very sharp observation of the text's underlying philosophy. Riker does acknowledge female agency, but he believes it is ultimately inescapably bound by hard evolutionary limits.
Okay.
He argues that when women use their agency to pursue what the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir called existential freedom, meaning abandoning the traditional family structure to seek career dominance and absolute independence, they inevitably end up miserable because they are using their agency to wage a war against their own biological imperatives. To Riker, true female agency isn't about doing whatever you want. It is about recognizing biological reality and choosing a path that aligns with nature, rather than fighting a losing decades-long war against it.
So freedom to him isn't the absence of constraints. It's aligning yourself with your biological constraints. And that perfectly sets up our final section. We've talked about the problem, the Frankfurt School ideology, the biological reality of legal traps, and the societal collapse of feminism. Now, we shift the focus to Riker's actual solutions.
The blueprint.
What is the blueprint? And this isn't just a political counteroffensive to Riker. This is spiritual warfare.
He elevates the stakes from the political to the biblical. He equates woke institutional ideology not just to bad public policy, but to a modern golden calf. It is idolatry. He isn't asking his readers to vote harder in the next midterms or write polite letters to their local congressman. He is advocating for militant, uncompromising disobedience.
He calls these his Old Testament tactics. What does that actually look like in practice for the men reading this book?
It involves radical, immediate action within the household. He tells fathers to literally physically smash their children's Xboxes and iPads to break the addiction to digital passivity and state-approved media.
Literally smash them.
Yeah. He tells them to burn rainbow flags if they find them in their homes. And most importantly, he advocates for the mass extraction of hostages.
By hostages, he means children.
Yes. He demands that parents pull their kids out of the public school system entirely, regardless of the financial hardship, and homeschool them with classical Western curricula focused on history, logic, and traditional theology.
He wants a complete parallel society.
Yeah.
And he highlights specific heroes in his worldview, everyday people who are already engaging in this militant defiance, like the pastor in Houston.
Yes, he tells the story of a Houston pastor who was arrested for vandalism. The city had painted a rainbow crosswalk during Pride Month. This pastor filled a massive super soaker water gun with holy water, marched out into the intersection, and doused the entire crosswalk while loudly shouting scriptures about Sodom and Gomorrah.
A super soaker full of holy water. That is, to the city, it was a hate crime. But to Riker, it was an act of holy consecration.
And then there is Gladys Perkins, the Florida retiree we mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Gladys is a legendary figure in Riker's narrative. When her local school board refused to allow conservative parents to opt their kids out of a controversial Pride Story Hour, this 78-year-old woman calmly walked into the superintendent's office, sat down in a chair, and began reciting the book of Leviticus out loud.
She did this for 3 hours straight. The school called security. They even called EMTs to try and claim she was having a medical episode so they could remove her.
But she refused to leave until they canceled the event. And ultimately, exhausted by the standoff, they did.
It's the ultimate example of an immovable object. But his favorite example, the ultimate proof of concept for his entire philosophy, is Betty Wilkins.
Right. Betty is another grandmother. She spent 6 months making and selling handmade quilts at local craft fairs just to raise enough money to buy 100 copies of Riker's book.
She bought them in bulk and used them to start a manliness boot camp at her local Baptist church for young, fatherless men in her community.
And the result? Riker says that within weeks, these young, previously directionless, video game-addicted men were out in the community, physically rebuilding a local widow's collapsed porch. They traded their controllers for hammers.
If we pause and look at what Riker is actually doing here, this is the profound insight of the entire book. Riker's book isn't just a political manifesto, it is a translation manual.
A translation manual, that's a good way to put it.
It takes the complex, invisible, crushing anxieties of displaced modern men, men who feel like they are failing in the modern economy, failing in the dating market, failing to find purpose, and gives them a concrete, visible enemy. It translates their personal failures into righteous victimhood.
Right. He is telling his red-pilled audience, to trade their culturally imposed guilt for holy, righteous rage. He relies on that raw data, the fact that men built 99% of the world's infrastructure and invented 97% of its technology to tell them, you built the world, stop asking permission to live in it.
It is a profoundly empowering message for a demographic that feels entirely marginalized by modern institutions. But to execute this war, he advocates for some very modern tactics.
And this is where I have to call out his methodology. Riker actively advocates for using meme warfare. He tells his readers to shitpost online to create viral, highly offensive optics that humiliate their institutional opponents.
He specifically compares a viral meme to David live streaming his takedown of Goliath with a slingshot.
But hold on. Isn't he using the exact same postmodern deconstructive tools of the digital age that he accuses the radical left of using? He's not unplugging from the digital matrix, he's just trying to hack the code. He's fighting cultural Marxism with internet trolling.
He absolutely is, and he is entirely unapologetic about it. Riker explicitly notes that irony bypasses the brain's dogma filters.
Oh, that's interesting.
He knows that a dense, 200-page conservative essay won't change a teenager's mind, but a perfectly timed, ruthless, viral meme will instantly shatter the aura of authority around a progressive institution.
So it's a modern insurgency using ancient principles of psychological warfare.
Exactly. He views the digital landscape not as something to retreat from, but as just another battlefield where male testosterone, aggression, and dark humor can be channeled effectively to destroy the enemy's morale.
Well, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. To summarize the journey we just took, we have explored Conrad Riker's intense, deeply provocative worldview. We've mapped out his arguments starting from the Frankfurt School's methodical, ideological capture of our institutions.
We deeply examine his reliance on evolutionary psychology, the biological reality of testosterone, and the 300% survival rate of patriarchal societies.
We navigated the treacherous legal battleground of no-fault divorce, the marriage plantation, and the weaponization of Title IX.
We analyzed his views on the existential collapse of modern feminism and the biological inevitability of the trad wife.
And finally, we looked at his call for a spiritual and cultural insurgency using militant fatherhood, Old Testament disobedience, and digital meme warfare.
It is a comprehensive, aggressively argued framework that leaves almost no part of modern life unexamined. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final overarching thought to mull over.
I'm ready.
Riker bases his entire philosophy on the premise that biological reality and historical survival are the ultimate arbiters of truth. It forces us to ask a profound, uncomfortable question. What if the ultimate test of any societal ideology isn't its moral appeal, its inclusivity, its empathy, or its intellectual elegance, but simply its physical survival rate over centuries?
Wow.
If a beautiful egalitarian ideology cannot sustain its birth rates, maintain its physical infrastructure, or produce men willing to defend its borders, does its moral intent even matter in the long run?
If an ideology cannot survive contact with physical reality, does it matter how kind it is? That is a heavy, lingering question to end on. Whether you vehemently agree with Riker's conclusions, or you fundamentally view his worldview as backwards and dangerous, his book is undeniably a fascinating, incisive translation manual for a rapidly growing cultural movement that is actively shaping the behavior of the men around us.
We highly encourage you to explore the source material yourself. Please make sure to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Dealing with Evil, God's Justice, and the War on Cultural Marxism.
And to read more directly from the source and see how these ideas are developing in real time, follow @ConradMacRecker at Substack. Finally, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you never miss a deep dive. We tackle the complex, the controversial, and the crucial, and we love having you with us on the journey. Thank you for joining the conversation.